Here's a little bit of a note session on the reading that you're doing on Kandel right now on depression and anxiety. So I was typing up some of my notes, and I thought it might be helpful to share these with you as you are reading as well. So if you remember that we read a little bit on this earlier, and now we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the brain and how the brain is affected under these conditions of depression and anxiety. So one thing to do is to introduce you to this idea of something called the Hpa Axis. And Hpa stands for Hypothalamic, Pituitary, and Adrenal Axis. And what this is this is a well-known sort of loop that looks at what does the body do under certain stressful conditions. So the hypothalamus, as you know, is in the brain, and the hypothalamus can communicate with the pituitary gland. And when it does, it can send out messages via the pituitary gland, and one of the targets can be the adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland is the gland that's found on the top of the kidneys, actually. And so, but its main role, the adrenal gland, is to produce a number of things, including this stress hormone called cortisol. So cortisol is released in response to stress. So you can think about this as being activated when we have a fight or flight response. So when the sympathetic nervous system is being activated. And what it does from the evolutionary standpoint is it creates a state of vigilance. So vigilance is when we're paying like super attention to our surroundings. We want to do that because there's some threat that we've noted, and therefore we want to be sure that we're ready to respond to that threat. So that's good by and large, because especially if there is an actual threat, we want to be sure that we're able to do that. And so this is going to activate when we become this state of vigilance starts. We're going to be basically think about all the things that would be a sympathetic response. So our heart rate will increase, our blood pressure will increase, we'll start mobilizing in our bloodstream a lot more sugar. In other words, our liver takes some of the sugar that we have in storage in the form of something, if you remember, glycogen, which is a stored form of energy. It's going to convert that into glucose. It's going to put it into our bloodstream. So what that's going to do is going to get us ready for this fight or flight response. And meanwhile, other things will happen too. But these are some of the principal things we see. So in the short term, that's good. In the long term, that's not good. And so when we're in a constant state of vigilance, that's going to affect all sorts of other things that can be very harmful. So one of the things, and one of the areas in the brain that is particularly susceptible to high levels of cortisol is our hippocampus. So in the hippocampus, when we have this high level of cortisol all the time, it starts to actually break down and destroy some of those synaptic connections. And as you've just learned, the hippocampus is kind of a critical area for memory. It's for our initial memory formations, as well as some other things, but we'll get into that a little later. And the other part that's affected is the PFC. So PFC is the prefrontal cortex. And it's our PFC that, if you remember, has a lot to do with how we respond to things, how we regulate, including, whether or not we want to live, whether or not it looks at decision making. It has a critical role in more long-term memory storage. And so when these areas are impacted by these high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, we're going to start to see some real effects. And that's because in the brain, in these particular areas, there are receptors on the neurons in these areas for that, for cortisol. And so it's going to cause a response there. Now, some of the things it does is it impairs memory. It affects our concentration. And it can result in something called a flattened affect, or just like lack of any emotion. Sometimes that's called anhedonia, just kind of like this, you just don't care. And so let's look at the circuitry of depression. First, I referred you to page 65 in Kandel, so you can look at where some of this came from. And there are a number of places that are involved with this circuitry. One of them is called the subclosal cingulate cortex. So subclosal means right underneath the corpus callosum. And remember that the cingulate, you've seen the cingulate before, but where we're going to look at an area that is a gyrus, actually right underneath there. That's an important area for a couple of things. One is that it produces serotonin, or 5-HT. So you know that serotonin is involved with mood, right? That's that mood. It's a modulator of the mood. So this, sorry, I should back up a little bit. In this area, the cells of the subclosal cingulate cortex are producing not serotonin so much as they're producing the transporters for serotonin. So remember, the transporters are the ones that are going to bring serotonin back into a presynaptic cell. So it kind of clears the synapse. So it's important. So it's going to tune this circuitry, especially because this is a neuromodulator. It's going to have to do with sort of tuning what's going on in this circuitry. So if you have an increase in these transporters, or increased activity in these transporters, then you're going to get rid of the serotonin maybe a little too quickly. So this is one of the targets for medications for depression, like Prozac, and boy, I should just be able to remember these, but they're not coming to mind. But we'll talk about some of these. But the reason, one of the ways that they work is because what they do is they slow down or they inhibit these transporters so that we can keep more serotonin in those circuits to activate the postsynaptic cells. Okay, sorry, I had to stop there. I'm at school, and so the music was playing in the background. So another area is called the insula. And the right anterior insula, now this area on the insula, is an area that's associated with this concept of our own self-awareness and our awareness of social experiences. And so it's going to get lots of information from other areas of the body to kind of let us know what's happening and give us information that helps us to sort of form this self-awareness and kind of weigh out what's happening with our social experience. And what it does, so once it gets this information from the body, and then it in turn communicates with the hypothalamus, with the hippocampus, and with the prefrontal cortex. So it's going to talk to the hypothalamus. And remember, our hypothalamus has all these different little subnuclei all throughout it, which regulate all sorts of stuff, including our sleep and our appetite. And then the hippocampus, again, memory, and you know what the prefrontal cortex is. So let's move on just a little. All right, and the next area that's involved with the circuitry is the anterior cingulate gyrus. So the anterior cingulate gyrus is like, it talks to everybody. It's like this, it's similar in some sense to the thalamus in that it is an area that gets communicated with and then communicates to all sorts of stuff. So it will send projections or, its axons down to the hippocampus, to the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, to the anterior insula, and to an area called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is involved with the reward pathway. This is where dopamine is involved. So let's keep going. And what I did here is just to kind of show you some of the pathways that you can see this in. So here's our prefrontal cortex, and purple, there's the medial prefrontal cortex. This yellow part is just showing, highlighting part of the anterior cingulate cortex right here. The amygdala is kind of down here. Here's the hippocampus. And so on this diagram to the right of it, what you see is a lot of complicated circuitry. Who's talking to whom? And which ones are using GABA to inhibit some of these areas while this is going on versus glutamate. So GABAergic versus glutamatergic. Versus dopamine. So which direction some of these pathways, who's talking to whom, and then who's getting released in response. So you don't need to memorize this, but it's just an interesting diagram to say, oh, look at all the communication that's going on within this circuitry of depression and emotional regulation. So we'll move just a little bit further down here. So this is kind of nice because what it's saying is, okay, what is the role of dopamine in some of these pathways? And so we can see reward and pleasure, and it has to do with perseveration and compulsion. So perseveration means like when we just keep going over and over something constantly in our heads, like we can't get rid of it. So that's dopamine can be involved with that pathway. And serotonin is involved with mood regulation and sleep and memory processing. So here's just to show you sort of some of this activity in these areas and what some of those brain areas really are. So this is the ventral tegmental area here. There's the nucleus accumbens I just mentioned. Here's the frontal cortex, etc. There's a raphe nucleus. So what happens in terms of treatment of these disorders of depression can vary a great deal, and historically when this is sort of figured out, we've used these things called SSRIs, which are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which sort of remember that serotonin is a modulator. Physical interruption there. So back to this. So remember, there's a difference between something that modulates. So a modulator is something that's sort of fine-tuning a circuit, and that's most of the neurotransmitters we've talked about were modulators. Mediators are the ones that have direct effect. So the mediators would be things like glutamate and GABA. The ones that directly affect the neurons next door, where modulators are kind of, like I said, fine-tuning. So one of the newest areas of research out is in depression is using something that's not doesn't have a modulating effect, but has something much more significant, and that is this one. So using ketamine. Now you may have heard of ketamine. Ketamine has been it was really used in veterinary medicine quite a bit. It's actually become kind of a street drug. It has some real dangers to it too. But in a therapeutic sense, ketamine is able to block the glutamate receptors. And so I'm going to leave this blank here. So if ketamine is being administered to block glutamate receptors, it would be called an So if it's blocking, is it an antagonist or is it an agonist? And if it's coming from outside the body, it's exogenous. So I just wanted to leave that there to see if you could kind of think about how we could describe ketamine. It would be an exogenous antagonist. So in this case, I got to hurry here. Both of these, when they're administered, have a really good effect in that they're going to increase the growth of some of these synaptic areas that would be impacted in both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. The last thing, which we can talk about more in class, is the benefits of psychotherapy, sometimes called talk therapy, and particularly the benefits when combined with drug therapy. So I'll tell you a little bit more in class about brain stimulation and how that has some real positive effects. So that's it. See you in class.